October 23, 1929. The New York Stock Exchange on Wall Street, New York City. 6 million shares had been traded. The industrial average fell 21 points. According to U.S. News and World Report, brokers told one another that tomorrow morning the turn would come. Prices, they said, had been carried to unreasonably low levels. But on October 24th, which would come to be known as Black Thursday, panic reigned as 13 million stocks were traded. The ticker could not keep up with the selling and ran behind by nearly 5 hours. It finally stopped printing out quotations at 7:08 p.m. Over the course of 2 days, the market had lost over $30 billion. From 1929 to 1933, production at the nation's factories, mines, and utilities fell by more than half. People's real disposable incomes dropped 28%. Stock prices collapsed to 1/10 of their pre-crash height. 1 out of every 4 Americans was out of a job in the darkest days of the Depression. Breadlines stretched across city streets. Shanty towns appeared in New York City's Central Park. Food riots broke out. The Great Depression would go down in history as the longest and most economically devastating depression in the history of the United States. Lawrence Reed, president of the Foundation for Economic Education, in his book Great Myths of the Great Depression, refutes what he believes to be the greatest myth of the 20th century. This myth, propagated by mainstream economists and political science textbooks, teaches that capitalism and the free market economy were responsible for the Great Depression, and only government intervention brought about America's economic recovery. The Great Depression should have run its course in 2 to 3 years' time, like other depressions in the nation's history. However, the Great Depression was 3 times longer than the worst depression up to that time. Reed's thesis is that the government caused the Great Depression and compounded its initial errors with a series of additional and harmful interventions. Reed argues that the Great Depression should be understood as 4 consecutive downturns rolled into one. These 4 phases are monetary policy, the disintegration of the world economy, the New Deal, the Wagner Act. Reed pinpoints the start of the Great Depression as central planners' failure at monetary policy. Reed shows that the cause of the Great Depression cannot be attributed to frenzied speculation in shares fed by excessive margin lending. According to economist Gene Smiley, there was already a long history of margin lending on stock exchanges, and margin requirements were no lower in the late 20s than in the early 20s or in previous decades. According to Austrian school economists, government inflation of the money supply will lead to a boom-bust cycle. Referencing Murray Rothbard's book, America's Great Depression, Reed showed that the Federal Reserve expanded the money supply by more than 60% from 1921 to 28. This drove down interest rates and drove up the stock market and gave rise to the Roaring Twenties. By 1928, the Federal Reserve was raising interest rates and decreasing the money supply. The Fed's deflationary actions would continue for 3 years. The money supply would shrink by 30%. Citing Milton Friedman and Anna Schwartz, the shrinking of the money supply was an enormous drag on the economy, and largely the result of seismic incompetence by the Fed. Reed argues that the stock market crash was only a reflection, not the direct cause, of the destructive government policies that would ultimately produce the Great Depression. Herbert Hoover was president at the outset of the Great Depression. Mainstream economists often deride Hoover for combating the Depression by following a policy of non-interventionist, laissez-faire economics. However, Reed argues that Hoover did not adopt a hands-off-the-economy approach. According to Reed, the first Hoover folly was the Smoot-Hawley tariff, passed in June 1930. The stock market fell 20 points on the day the tariff was signed. The tariff effectively barred all imports of foreign goods. Reed argues that if foreign nations cannot sell here, then they will not buy here. Indeed, American agriculture suffered from the tariff. As farm prices fell and thousands of farmers went bankrupt, 9,000 rural banks closed their doors between 1930 and 1933. Other Hoover follies listed by Reed include his high-wage policy and government spending on subsidy and relief programs. Rexford Guy Tugwell, who helped Roosevelt design his New Deal policies in the 1930s, stated, "We didn't admit it at the time, but practically the whole New Deal was extrapolated from programs that Hoover started." When Roosevelt won the 1932 election, Congress soon gave him the power to seize the gold of private citizens and fix the price of gold. Reed observes that by rejecting the gold standard, Roosevelt helped remove most of the remaining impediments to limitless currency and credit expansion, for which the nation would pay a high price in later years in the form of a depreciating currency. The federal debt skyrocketed to 73%, and numerous tax hikes were imposed. As part of his New Deal, the National Industrial Recovery Act was passed in 1933, which created the National Recovery Administration. The NRA enforced more than 500 new production codes that raised the cost of doing business by 40%. Roosevelt's Civil Works Administration evolved into the Works Progress Administration. The WPA created a wide range of unnecessary jobs, like cataloging different ways to cook spinach. FDR's programs did little to help the economy recover. Between August 1937 and March 1938, the stock market crashed nearly 50%. Reed writes that FDR's economic stimulus had achieved a depression within a depression. Economists like Paul Krugman blame the 1937-38 collapse on a reduction in government spending. According to Reed, these Keynesian economists argue that Roosevelt caused the collapse by reining in expenditures after nearly doubling federal spending in his first term. However, Reed argues that Roosevelt's reduction was less than 1% of GDP. According to Reed, the National Labor Relations Act of 1935, better known as the Wagner Act, was the true tipping point in causing the depression within a depression. As a result of the act, Reed observes that threats, boycotts, strikes, seizures of plants, and widespread violence pushed productivity down sharply. Unemployment rose over the 10 million mark.